Hello, and welcome back to another evening of quiet company. Tonight we are going to do something a little different. We are not going to recap the seasons of Dexter, or rank the villains, or argue about which year the writing peaked, or relitigate whether the finale was as bad as everyone says it was. There will be no scorecards, no outrage, none of that. Tonight we are going to stay with one idea, one very specific thread that runs through every single season of this show like a wire pulled just slightly too tight. And that idea is the code of Harry, the rules that Dexter Morgan was supposed to live by. The rules that defined him, contained him, gave his darkness a shape and a direction. And every time across 8 seasons of the original show and everything that came after, every single time those rules bent or cracked or quietly shattered and fell apart on the floor. Now, before we get into it, I want to say something important, because I think it matters for the kind of conversation we're about to have. This is not an attack on Dexter. I want to be very clear about that. Pointing out the moments when a character breaks their own moral framework is not the same as saying the show is flawed, or the writers were careless, or that any of this was a mistake. It is actually the opposite of that. The fact that we have watched these episodes closely enough to notice these fractures, the fact that we care enough about the code to ask whether it was honored or abandoned in any given scene, that is a sign of how well constructed this show was at its core. You do not analyze the moral architecture of a show you do not care about. You just stop watching. So think of tonight more like a late evening between 2 people who have seen the whole thing more times than they would probably admit to anyone. Sitting somewhere comfortable and going through it together. Not angry about any of it, just curious, just wanting to look at it closely, because looking closely at something you love is its own kind of appreciation. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight. We are going to start at the very beginning, back when the code was new and Harry Morgan was still alive, and the rules felt almost sacred. We will walk through season 1 and find the first cracks, small ones, easy to miss if you're not watching for them. Then we move forward through the seasons, violation by violation, each one building on the last, each one a little harder to walk back than the one before it. We will spend a long time in season 2 because season 2 is where the code meets its first genuinely devastating test. We will talk about season 3 and what happens when Dexter decides, against everything Harry taught him, that it might be safe to bring someone else inside. We will talk about season 4 and the Trinity Killer and the most expensive delay in the history of this show. We will make our way through the later seasons, which are messier and more complicated, and arrive finally at New Blood, in the snow, in a small town in upstate New York, where the code reaches the only ending it was ever really heading toward. And somewhere along the way, if you are comfortable and your eyes are getting heavy, that is completely fine. That is the whole idea. This will still be here when you come back to it. There is no rush tonight. Before we go any further, if you enjoy this kind of content, if spending an evening inside the world of Dexter sounds like exactly the kind of company you want, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps, and it means we can keep doing this. But that is enough of that. Get comfortable. Settle in. Let us spend the evening with America's favorite serial killer, and every single time he broke the only promise that mattered. Let me start by making sure we are all working from the same understanding of what the Code of Harry actually was. Because the code is not a document. There is no laminated card. There is no written rulebook that Harry Morgan sat down at a desk and composed one afternoon. The code is something that evolved, that was built slowly over years, across dozens of conversations and flashbacks and lessons delivered in kitchens and in cars and on fishing trips, between a father and a child who was not like other children and who was never going to be. Harry Morgan was a homicide detective for the Miami Metro Police Department. He was good at his job. He understood violence in the way that only someone who has spent years documenting its aftermath really can. And when he discovered what his adoptive son Dexter was, when he understood that the boy had been watching him, tracking criminals through case files, learning to hunt, Harry made a decision that you could spend a very long time arguing about. He decided not to try to stop it. He decided instead to aim it. The code emerged from that decision. And the first and most fundamental rule, the one that everything else flows from, is this: only kill those who have killed. More specifically, only kill those who have murdered and who will murder again. Dexter's targets must be killers who have slipped through the cracks of the legitimate justice system, either through corruption, through legal technicality, through insufficient evidence, or through some failure of the institutions that are supposed to protect people. The code is not a vigilante philosophy in the casual sense of the word. It is something more specific than that. It is a framework designed to give the dark passenger a moral justification, a set of conditions without which the kill cannot happen. The second pillar is never kill the innocent. This one sounds redundant given the first rule, but it is not. It is its own distinct constraint. Because there are situations, as the series will demonstrate again and again, where killing an innocent person would be enormously convenient for Dexter, where it would solve a problem, where it would protect his secret, or his family, or his freedom, and Harry's code says no. Not because Dexter would not survive it, but because the moment he kills an innocent person, he is no longer the man Harry tried to build. He is just a killer, undirected, purposeless, everything the code was designed to prevent. The third pillar is do not get caught. Blend in, maintain the mask. The social performance that Dexter runs every single day, the donuts and the cheerful greetings and the manufactured warmth, all of it is the code in action. Not because Harry wanted Dexter to be dishonest, but because Harry understood that a man who cannot contain his secret is a man who cannot protect anyone, including himself. Getting caught does not just end Dexter, it ends the work. It ends the mission. It ends the possibility that any of this means anything at all. The fourth pillar is perhaps the quietest and the most important. Never let emotion steer the knife. The kills must be deliberate, methodical, chosen for reasons that can survive scrutiny. Not because Dexter is angry, not because someone has hurt him or someone he loves, not because he wants something. The moment the kill becomes personal in the emotional sense, the moment it is driven by grief or rage or love or loneliness, the code is already gone. What remains is just a man acting on feeling, which is the thing Harry feared most about what his son could become. And the fifth pillar, the one that does not get discussed as often, but turns out to be among the most consequential. Work alone. Do not involve anyone else. The darkness belongs to Dexter and to no one else. Harry understood with a clarity that Dexter will spend 8 seasons struggling to match, that the code is not transferable, that darkness shared does not have. It multiplies, that another person inside the secret is not a comfort. It is a liability, a countdown. These 5 pillars: kill only killers. Never kill the innocent. Do not get caught. Let no emotion steer the knife. Work alone. They are the whole structure. And every single violation we are going to talk about tonight traces back to at least one of them, and often to several at once. One more thing before we move into the seasons, and I think this is worth sitting with for a moment. The code was built by a man who loved his child. That is the thing about Harry that the show establishes early and then returns to constantly in the flashbacks, in the ghost of Harry that appears to Dexter as a kind of conscience throughout the series. Harry was not a cold man designing a system. He was a father trying desperately and imperfectly to give his son a way to live without destroying everything around him. And there is an extraordinary irony sitting right at the center of that, because the force that would eventually dismantle the code, rule by rule, across 12 years of storytelling, is the same force that created it in the first place. Love. Harry built the code out of love for Dexter, and every crack in the code, without a single exception, can be traced back to something Dexter loved. His brother, his sister, a woman, a friend, his son. The code of Harry was always going to lose, not because the rules were wrong, but because the man living by them was never quite as empty as either of them believed. That's the whole story in a way. But let us take our time with it. Let us start at the beginning. The first season of Dexter does something remarkable that sometimes gets lost in the broader conversation about the show. It presents the code as something sacred. Not sacred in a religious sense, but in the sense that Dexter genuinely believes in it. He is not going through the motions. He's not performing compliance for Harry's ghost. In Season 1, Dexter Morgan is a man who has found the only moral framework that makes sense to him, and he holds it the way a person holds something that was given to them by someone they loved and then lost, with care, with a kind of tenderness that is almost startling given everything else he is. Watch him in the early episodes. Watch the ritual of the kill, the verification, the research. the careful accumulation of evidence before he ever acquires a target, the way he processes the blood slide, the way he holds it up and examines it, the way the whole ceremony of the kill is wrapped in deliberateness. That is the code in action. That is Harry's voice in the methodology. And in Season 1, Dexter believes in it enough to follow it almost entirely. Almost. Because even in the first season, with the code still fresh and Harry's lessons still warm in the room, there are two moments that deserve careful attention. Two places where the code bends, not catastrophically, not yet, but enough that you can see the shape of what is coming if you are paying attention. The first one involves a man named Paul Bennett. Paul Bennett is Rita's ex-husband. He is an addict, and he is violent, and he is, by the time we meet him in Season 1, a genuine threat to the family that Dexter has built his mask around. Rita and her children, Aster and Cody, are the domestic arrangement that make Dexter legible to the world. They are the evidence that he is normal, and Paul, who shows up drunk and breaks into Rita's house and assaults her and makes her children afraid, is a direct threat to that arrangement. Now, here is the question the code asks. Does Paul Bennett belong on Dexter's table? And the honest answer, by the rules Harry established, is no, not yet. Paul is violent, and he is dangerous, and he has genuinely hurt the people Dexter has chosen to protect. But Paul has not killed anyone that Dexter can confirm. Paul is an abuser, a drug addict, a man whose presence in Rita's life is a kind of ongoing damage. But the code's first rule is very specific. It says killers. It says people who have taken a life and will take another. And Paul Bennett, as of the first season of Dexter, does not meet that standard. So what does Dexter do? He does not kill Paul. That much is true. And if you were watching casually, you might conclude that Dexter simply chose not to act because the code did not permit it, that he honored the rule. But that is not quite what happens. What happens is that Dexter plants evidence. He puts Paul's shoe at a crime scene. He engineers Paul's return to prison, using the existing justice system as a weapon, using evidence and timing and careful manipulation to send a man away for crimes that are real but not the crimes being charged. Paul goes back to prison, and Paul dies there. Think about that for a second. Dexter did not kill Paul Bennett, but Paul Bennett is dead because of what Dexter did. And Paul was sent away not because the code sanctioned it, not because Paul met the criteria, but because Paul was a problem that Dexter wanted solved. Because Paul's presence was inconvenient. Because Dexter wanted Rita, and Paul was in the way. This is the first crack. It is small, and it is clean, and it is easy to miss, because Paul was genuinely awful. And Dexter's manipulation of him feels almost like justice if you are not watching carefully. But Harry's code does not have a clause for engineering someone's imprisonment as a substitute for killing them. The code says, confirm guilt, then act with your own hands, or do not act at all. What Dexter does with Paul Bennett is use the justice system as a proxy. He outsources the consequence while keeping his own hands technically clean. And it works, which is in its own way the most interesting thing about it. Because it works, Dexter learns something. He learns that the rules have more flexibility than Harry let on, that there are other ways to handle a problem, that the code is a framework, not a cage. And that piece of knowledge, that lesson learned before the first season is even finished, is going to do a great deal of damage over the years that follow. Now let me talk about the other crack in Season 1, the bigger one, the one that hits differently because of what it asks of Dexter emotionally, the ice truck killer. That is what Miami Metro calls him in the first season. A serial killer leaving bloodless, meticulously staged bodies, showing a level of forensic awareness that clearly belongs to someone who knows exactly how crime scenes are investigated. As the season progresses, the investigation circles closer and closer to a man named Rudy Cooper, a prosthetics specialist who is dating Deborah Morgan, Dexter's adoptive sister. And then the reveal. Rudy Cooper is Brian Moser. And Brian Moser is Dexter's biological brother. They were both present in that shipping container as children. They both sat in their mother's blood. They were both shaped by the same moment of horror. And they both emerged from it as something other than ordinary. By every measure of the code, Brian Moser belongs on Dexter's table. He is a serial killer. He has murdered multiple women. He will not stop. There is no version of the code's first rule that does not look at Brian Moser and point. Dexter knows this. He says it. He acknowledges it. The code is not confused here. And yet Dexter hesitates. He does not hesitate because he doubts Brian's guilt. The evidence is overwhelming. He does not hesitate because the code is unclear. The code is perfectly clear. He hesitates because Brian is blood, because for the first time in his entire adult life, Dexter is looking at someone who sees him completely, someone who does not need the mask, someone who understands the dark passenger not as a horror but as a simple fact. And that connection is intoxicating and devastating and paralyzing all at once. Dexter does eventually kill Brian. That is important to acknowledge. The code gets its outcome technically. Brian Moser is stopped. His victims are avenged. The math works. But the process, the weeks of hesitation, the back and forth, the moment where Dexter genuinely considers that maybe Brian could be something to him, a companion, a brother in the truest sense, that process is a violation of the code's fourth pillar before it ever resolves. The code says never let emotion steer the knife. The code says the decision is made before the feelings arrive, not after negotiating with them. Dexter spent weeks negotiating with his feelings about Brian. He let emotion into the room, he sat with it, he almost let it win. And when he finally kills his brother, it costs him something. You can see it. It is the first time in the series that killing someone genuinely costs Dexter Morgan something he did not expect to lose. That is the code bending under the weight of something Harry never fully accounted for in his framework. He taught Dexter what to do when the target is a stranger. He did not fully teach him what to do when the target is family. Because Harry, who was himself a father who loved his adopted son more than almost anything, may not have believed deep down that the code should extend to blood. Even as he built the rules, even as he made them as absolute as he could, Harry may have left that door unlocked. Season 1 ends with the code intact on the surface. Brian is dead, Paul is in prison, Dexter is still hidden, still safe, still standing behind his mask with his donuts and his cheerful wave and his forensics badge. But there are two small cracks in the foundation now. One in the rule about killing only killers, one in the rule about keeping emotion out of the equation. They are hairline fractures. They are barely visible. They are exactly the kind of thing you might convince yourself does not matter. But cracks in a foundation always matter. The question is only when, and Season 2 answers that question in the most devastating way the series ever would. There's a version of the Dexter story where James Dokes is the most important character in the entire series. Not because of what he does exactly, but because of what he represents, because of what he sees, because of what happens to him. Sergeant James Dokes, from the very first episode of the show, does not like Dexter Morgan. Not casually, not professionally, not in the way that colleagues sometimes rub each other the wrong way. He does not like Dexter Morgan in the specific, instinctive, almost cellular way that a certain kind of person sometimes dislikes something that their brain cannot quite classify. He stares at Dexter too long. He challenges his work in ways that feel personal rather than professional. He watches him in the hallways of Miami Metro with an expression that sits somewhere between suspicion and something harder to name, something more like recognition. And Dexter, in one of the most quietly important lines of internal monologue in the entire series, asks himself the question that the show will spend 2 seasons trying to answer. He says, in a building full of cops, all supposedly with a keen insight into the human soul, why is Dokes the only one who gets the creeps from me? It is worth taking a moment to understand why Dokes sees what no one else sees. Because the explanation matters, and because the explanation connects directly to the tragedy that Season 2 sets in motion. James Dokes served as a U.S. Army Ranger before he joined Miami Metro, specifically with the elite Regimental Reconnaissance Detachment, conducting black operations in places where the rules of engagement were not always clean, in situations where killing was the job and where the people doing that job were required to reconcile themselves privately and permanently to what that felt like. Dokes knows what it looks like when a man has taken a life. He knows what the aftermath looks like in someone's eyes, in the way they carry themselves, in the quality of their stillness. He knows this not from forensics textbooks, but from personal experience, from having looked at himself in the mirror after the fact and recognized the shape of it. And when Dokes looks at Dexter, he sees that shape, not the specifics, not the kill room or the plastic wrap or the blood slides hidden in the air conditioning unit, but the outline of it, the texture, The way Dexter moves through the world with a kind of deliberate calm that does not belong to innocent people. Dokes is not following a forensic trail, he is following his instincts. And his instincts, across 2 full seasons, are completely correct. This distinction matters enormously when we get to what happens to Dokes in Season 2, because the tragedy of Dokes is not that he was a victim of random circumstance or collateral damage in someone else's story. The tragedy of Dokes is that he was right. He was the only person in Dexter's life who looked at him and saw something true, and he paid for being right with everything he had. Season 2 begins with the discovery of Dexter's bodies. A team of divers working in the waters of Biscayne Bay comes across the remains of over 30 individuals, all dismembered in the same methodical way, all wrapped in the same way, bearing the forensic signature of someone working with extraordinary skill and consistency. The press immediately names this unknown killer the Bay Harbor Butcher, and the FBI, led by Agent Frank Lundy, is brought in to handle the investigation. Miami Metro is working the case too, which means that Dexter Morgan, blood spatter analyst, is in the middle of an investigation into his own crimes. This is already an extraordinary amount of pressure on the code's 3rd pillar: do not get caught. And Dexter manages it barely through a combination of forensic misdirection, controlled panic, and the particular advantage of being the expert in the room. But Dokes is not looking at the forensic evidence. Dokes is looking at Dexter. And somewhere around the middle of the season, Dokes starts following him. He puts a tracker on Dexter's car. He monitors his movements. He is doing, in the language of police work, exactly what an investigator does when they have a gut feeling they cannot yet prove. He is building a case from the ground up, not from the physical evidence, but from the behavioral pattern. And then Dokes follows Dexter to a marina. He watches Dexter on his boat. He sees things he cannot yet name, but that his Army Ranger training tells him absolutely cannot be innocent. And soon enough, through a series of increasingly dangerous encounters, Dokes comes to know exactly what Dexter is. The confrontation between them, when it finally arrives, is one of the most tense and well-constructed sequences in the show's history. Dokes has Dexter, he has the evidence, he has his own testimony, he has enough to destroy him. And Dexter, who has been trained his entire adult life to anticipate exactly this kind of situation, does not kill him. Instead, Dexter captures Dokes and holds him in a remote cabin in the Everglades, away from civilization, while he figures out what to do. And here's where Season 2 becomes, for the purposes of our conversation tonight, the most important season in the show's run, because Dexter has Dokes in that cabin for several episodes. Days pass. And during those days, Dexter faces the most direct confrontation the Code has ever had with its own rules. Is James Dokes a killer? By the Code's definition, the answer is no. He killed in combat, under orders, in a context that the Code has never been designed to evaluate. He killed as a soldier, not as a murderer. He is, by Harry's framework, innocent. He is a cop who has done an extraordinary amount of investigative work and arrived at a correct conclusion, and his reward for that correctness is being held in a cage in the swamp by the man he was right about. Dexter knows all of this. He says it. He turns the question over. He examines it from every angle. He looks for a way to make Dokes fit the Code and cannot find one. The Code is actually working exactly the way it is supposed to work in this moment. It is saying no. It is protecting an innocent man from Dexter's hands, and Dexter keeps Dokes in the cabin anyway. He does not kill him. He does not release him. He delays, he waits, he lets time pass while the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation continues outside, while Dokes sits caged in the Everglades, while Dexter tells himself he is working on a solution. And then Lila Tournay arrives at the cabin. Lila is Dexter's NA sponsor during Season 2, a British artist and recovering addict who Dexter is using as a cover for his dark passenger while pretending to work the Narcotics Anonymous program that Rita has asked him to join. Lila is unstable. She is possessive. She has fallen in love with Dexter in the particular way of someone who has decided that another person's secret defines them both. And she is clever enough and obsessive enough to track Dexter to the cabin in the Everglades. What Lila does when she finds the cabin, when she sees what is inside, when she understands enough of what is happening to make a decision of her own, is she blows it up. She locks the doors from the outside and she ignites the propane and she walks away. And James Dokes dies in the fire. Dexter did not pull a trigger. He did not use a knife. He did not bring James Dokes to a table wrapped in plastic. He did not make the choice, in that immediate sense, that ended Dokes' life. And yet, every rule the code contains, every pillar Harry built, exists for exactly this kind of situation. The code does not have a clause that says it only applies when Dexter is the direct agent. The code's second rule, never kill the innocent, does not come with a footnote that says unless someone else does it for you while you're still working on a solution. Dokes was innocent by the code. He is dead. Dexter's inaction, his delay, his inability to either release Dokes or find another way forward, created the window in which Lila acted. James Dokes died because Dexter Morgan could not bring himself to do the right thing when the right thing was harder than the code made it look. The right thing, by the code's own logic, was to release him, to face the consequences, to accept that the code's third rule, do not get caught, had finally been beaten. Dokes had caught him, and the code does not say evade capture at the cost of an innocent life. The code says do not get caught, not because getting caught is the worst possible thing, but because the work requires freedom. But the work cannot require innocents to die for it. That is the contradiction Dexter never resolves in Season 2. He prioritizes his own survival above the code's most fundamental rule. And the show makes Dexter pay for it, not immediately, not in Season 2 itself, where the Bay Harbor butcher case is eventually closed with Dokes as the posthumous suspect, which is its own additional violation of everything the code stands for. But the show does not forget what happened in that cabin. It keeps a running tally. And the debt from James Dokes comes due eventually, in a season we will get to later, in a moment that is far less ambiguous and far more devastating. Before we leave Season 2, there is one more thing worth examining, and it is the question of Lila herself. After the cabin, after Dokes, after the Bay Harbor butcher case is closed, Lila becomes a problem. She is a loose end in the most literal sense. She knows too much. She is unstable. She attempts to kill Dexter's adopted children, Aster and Cody, by setting her own apartment on fire with them inside. She is, by this point, genuinely dangerous. Dexter tracks Lila to Paris, where she has fled after her attempt on the children, and he kills her there. And by the code's first rule, Lila qualifies. She killed Dokes. She tried to kill children. She is a murderer by any definition. The victim selection is correct, but I want you to notice something about why Dexter kills Lila. Not what, but why. He does not kill her because the code demands it. He does not kill her because she is a threat to future victims who have not yet met her. He kills her because she is a threat to him, because she knows what he is, because she could expose him, because she is the most concrete danger to his continued freedom that exists at that moment in the story. The code's first rule is about justice. It is about protecting future victims from people who will kill again. Dexter killing Lila is about self-preservation dressed in the code's language. The distinction is subtle. It might sound like splitting hairs, but it is not. The code was built to point outward toward the protection of others. The moment it starts pointing inward toward the protection of Dexter, something essential has shifted. And in Season 2, it shifts. Not all the way, not irrecoverably, but enough that the direction of travel is now visible. The code, which began as a moral framework designed to give the dark passenger a conscience, has started to become something else. It is starting to become a tool, a justification, a story Dexter tells himself about why the things he does are defensible. Harry never intended that. Harry intended a conscience. What grows in its place, season by season, is a very sophisticated rationalization engine. And Season 2 is where that engine turns on for the first time. Let me also take a moment here before we move forward to think about the aftermath of Dokes' death in the context of the show's larger architecture. Because there is a painful irony in what happens next. With Dokes dead and the Bay Harbor butcher case closed, Dexter's position at Miami Metro actually becomes more stable. The pressure lifts, the investigation ends, life goes on, and Dexter goes on, carrying what happened to Dokes, what he allowed to happen to Dokes, in the private ledger that no one else can see. He is more careful for a while. You can see it. The early episodes of Season 3 have a Dexter who is holding the code a little tighter, processing it a little more carefully, as if the weight of the Dokes situation has made him more aware of what he is capable of losing. That kind of grief, even in a man who will tell you he does not fully feel things, leaves a mark. But the problem with carrying a lesson privately is that it can only do so much work. The lesson Dexter should have taken from James Stokes is that the code's boundaries exist for everyone, including himself. That no exception is ever as clean as it looks in the moment. That the moment you start making exceptions, the exceptions start making themselves. He did not take that lesson, not fully. And Season 3 is the evidence. Season 3 of Dexter is in some ways the season of a test that Harry never designed for. The code was built to manage the dark passenger in isolation, in secrecy, in the particular loneliness of a man who cannot share the truest thing about himself with anyone in his life. Harry understood that loneliness. He built the code, knowing it would be lonely. He probably believed that the loneliness was a feature rather than a bug. That a man who lived inside that kind of solitude would be less likely to make the kinds of mistakes that company invites. What Harry did not fully account for was the specific way that loneliness accumulates over years. The way it wears on a person even when that person is not quite certain they feel things the way other people do. The way the desire to be known, genuinely known, does not disappear simply because the thing about you that is most true is also the thing that could destroy you if it ever reached the wrong ears. Season 3 is the story of Dexter trying, for the first time, to not be alone with it. Miguel Prado is Miami's assistant district attorney. He is charming and sharp and politically ambitious, and he has a history with violence that is more complicated than his professional reputation suggests. When Dexter kills a man named Fribo, a drug dealer who was connected to the death of Oscar Prado, Miguel's brother, Miguel discovers that Dexter was responsible. He does not go to the police. He does not report it. Instead, he sits with what he knows. He turns it over. And then, gradually, he leans toward it. Miguel is drawn to Dexter's secret not because he is horrified by it, but because it offers him something he has wanted for a long time without quite knowing how to name it. Permission. Not permission in the legal sense. Permission in the deeper sense. He has spent his career inside a justice system that he knows, from personal experience, is imperfect and inconsistent and sometimes nakedly corrupt. He knows that people who deserve to be stopped are not always stopped. He knows that the law as a mechanism is imprecise. And Dexter, with his code and his table and his very precise form of extrajudicial action, represents the version of justice that Miguel has always secretly believed the world should have. Dexter, for his part, finds Miguel intoxicating for exactly the reason Harry feared. Miguel sees him, not the mask, not the cheerful forensics technician with the donuts and the manufactured warmth, the real him. And the real him, the part that has spent its entire adult life in a room of one, responds to being seen the way anyone would, with relief, with something that, in a different man, you would call gratitude. So Dexter lets Miguel in, not all at once, not carelessly, but incrementally and then irreversibly. He begins to share the logic of the code. He walks Miguel through the process of identifying and verifying a target. He brings Miguel alongside on a kill, allowing him to observe and then participating together. He does the thing that Harry's fifth pillar exists precisely to prevent. He teaches another person to do what he does. For a while, it works, or it appears to work. Miguel is a smart man, and he learns quickly, and the two of them share something that Dexter has genuinely never had before. A friendship built on truth. A relationship where the performance is not required. And there is something genuinely moving about watching Dexter experience that, even as you know from the shape of the season that it is not going to hold. It does not hold because Miguel Prado is not a man who was waiting for the code. He was waiting for permission. And the code, which is a system of rules and constraints, is not the same as permission. The code says, only those who have killed, only those who will kill again, only after verification, only in isolation, only by these means. Miguel hears something different. Miguel hears, you can do this. You can act on what you believe. The rules you have always privately resented do not apply to you. Miguel kills Ellen Wolf. Ellen Wolf is a defense attorney. She is a woman who has made a career of defending people. Miguel finds guilty of using the system in ways that Miguel finds personally offensive, of winning cases that Miguel believes should have been lost. She is not a killer. She has not murdered anyone. She is, by Harry's code, completely innocent. She is someone that the code would protect, not target. Miguel kills her anyway, because he can. Because Dexter showed him that he could and then did not explain clearly enough that the permission came with conditions. because the code was never really about permission, but Miguel translated it that way. Dexter has to kill Miguel to fix what he created, and he does. He goes through the full ritual. The verification, in this case, more personal than procedural. The confrontation, the table. Miguel Prado, assistant district attorney, friend and student, and ultimately threat, ends up in the Gulf of Mexico with the others. Dexter gets the outcome the code requires, but he gets it at the cost of having to undo with his hands what he created with his confidence. The lesson of Season 3 is the clearest statement the show ever makes about the fifth pillar. The code cannot be shared, not because sharing is inherently wrong, not because Dexter's loneliness does not matter, but because the code is not a thing that can survive translation. What Dexter carries is specific to Dexter. The history of it, the care of it, the particular relationship with Harry's voice in his head that governs every decision, none of that travels. What travels is only the surface, the permission, the license, and license without the code's constraints is just violence. Harry built the fifth pillar knowing that Dexter would someday be lonely enough to want to break it. He built it anyway, because he understood more clearly than Dexter ever would that the damage of breaking it would not be limited to Dexter, it would extend to everyone Dexter touched. Miguel Prado is dead. Ellen Wolf is dead. Two deaths that would not have happened if Dexter had honored the rule his father wrote to prevent exactly this. He does not honor it again in full for the rest of the series. The damage from this point forward compounds. Season 4 of Dexter is the best season of the show. I think most people who have watched it agree with that, and the numbers bear it out. The Season 4 finale, an episode called The Getaway, holds an IMDb rating of 9.8 out of 10. That is the highest rating of any episode in the entire series run. It is one of the highest rated individual television episodes you will find anywhere on that platform. It is a work of extraordinary storytelling featuring two performances from Michael C. Hall and from John Lithgow that are genuinely remarkable by any standard you want to apply. It is also the season that contains the single most consequential code violation in the entire show. Not the most explicit, not the most dramatic in the moment, the most consequential, the one with the biggest body count, the one that costs Dexter the most. Arthur Mitchell, who the press calls the Trinity Killer, has been killing for over 30 years by the time Dexter finds him. He is methodical in a way that is extraordinary even by the standards of a show full of methodical killers. He operates in cycles, 3 murders in a sequence, each representing a different emotional archetype, each performed with a precision and a ritual that suggests someone who has been doing this long enough to have refined it to an art. He has killed dozens of people across decades. He has never been caught. He has a family. He has a public persona as a church-going, charity-organizing, deeply civic man of his community. He is, in other words, the ultimate dark mirror for Dexter Morgan. Dexter identifies Arthur Mitchell. He gets close to him. He spends time with him under the cover of a false identity, a constructed persona named Kyle Butler, a man Dexter invents specifically to get near Trinity. And then, once he is near him, once the verification is beyond any doubt, Dexter does something that the code has never authorized and that Harry's voice in his head cannot explain away. He waits. He does not kill Arthur Mitchell when the code is satisfied. He delays. He tells himself he is studying Trinity, learning from him, trying to understand how a man with the dark passenger survives for 30 years without the things falling apart. Whether it is possible to have both the darkness and something real. Whether a man like Trinity, who by all appearances has sustained a marriage and raised children and maintained a functional life alongside 30 years of murder, might be able to teach Dexter something that Harry's code never addressed. There is a word for what Dexter's doing in Season 4, and the word is fascinated. He is fascinated by Arthur Mitchell, and fascination is an emotion. It has a direction and a weight and a pull. It is not logical. It is not code-sanctioned. It is exactly the kind of thing that Harry's fourth pillar was designed to prevent. A feeling that arrives before the kill and sits down and makes itself comfortable and starts asking questions that the code does not need, answered in order to function. While Dexter is fascinated, Trinity keeps killing. The show tracks this explicitly. Season 4 does not let the audience forget that Dexter has a target and is choosing not to act. Every episode that passes, every conversation between Dexter and Arthur that serves Dexter's curiosity rather than he finds Dexter's address. He finds the life that Dexter has spent years building and protecting. Dexter does eventually kill Arthur Mitchell. He kills him in a storage unit in the kill ritual with the full ceremony of the code. The outcome the code requires is achieved. Trinity is stopped. The work is done. And then Dexter comes home. Rita Bennett, Dexter's wife, is found in the bathtub of their home. She has been killed by the Trinity killer. Their infant son, Harrison, is sitting on the floor of the bathroom in a pool of his mother's blood. The image is an echo of Dexter's own earliest memory, the shipping container, his mother's blood, the foundational trauma that Harry built the code to manage. Rita is dead because Dexter waited, not because the code failed. Because Dexter chose curiosity over the code, chose wanting something for himself over the methodical and timely action that Harry's framework demands. The code's fourth pillar says, let no emotion steer the knife, but fascination is an emotion. And Dexter let it steer, not toward a kill, but away from one. And the delay cost someone her life. The show does not let Dexter off the hook for this. It does not frame Rita's death as a random tragedy or as the kind of narrative brutality that crime dramas occasionally employ to raise the stakes. It frames it as a consequence, as the result of a specific choice made by a specific man in violation of specific rules that existed precisely to prevent this kind of outcome. And the reason that framing works, the reason that Season 4's finale lands with the weight that it does, is that it is completely honest. Dexter broke the code. Someone died for it. That is the transaction. That is what Harry was always trying to prevent. Not Dexter getting caught. Not Dexter losing his freedom. Rita Bennett, Astor and Cody and Harrison growing up without a mother. That is what the code was for. And Season 4 shows what happens when it fails. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think we have just covered the most important stretch of Dexter's story from this perspective of the code. Seasons 1 through 4 form a kind of arc that the show itself seems to understand as a unit. Season 1 establishes the code and shows its first cracks. Season 2 tests it against an innocent man and allows that innocent man to die. Season 3 expands it against every instruction and has to kill the expansion to contain the damage. And Season 4 delays it out of personal desire and loses the thing that Dexter was protecting in the name of the code in the first place. By the end of Season 4, the code has failed in every major way Harry designed it to succeed. The innocent have not all been protected, the dark passenger has been shared, emotion has steered the knife, and someone who was never supposed to be touched by any of this is dead in a bathtub. The show continues for 4 more seasons, but something has changed. The code of Harry from the end of Season 4 forward is a different thing than it was in the beginning. It has not disappeared. Dexter still uses its language, still invokes its logic, still describes himself as a man who follows Harry's rules. But the rules have been tested badly enough that what remains is more fragile, more honored in the breach than the observance, and slowly but unmistakably becoming a story Dexter tells himself rather than a framework he actually lives inside. Let us keep going. The aftermath of Rita's death opens Season 5 of Dexter in a way that feels genuinely unlike anything the show had done before. The grief is real. Or as real as Dexter Morgan can make grief, which is its own complicated thing. He does not process it the way that other characters process loss. He processes it the way he processes everything, by cataloging it, by running it through the analytical part of himself that Harry trained so carefully, by trying to understand what he is feeling before he can decide what to do with it. What he is feeling, or something close to it, is guilt. Not guilt in the clean moral sense, not the kind of guilt that comes from having done a wrong thing knowingly. Something more like the recognition that an outcome he could have prevented was not prevented, that the code failed and that it failed in his hands. Harrison, his infant son, will grow up without a mother. And Dexter, who has already lost more than most people, carries that the way he carries all the things he cannot put down. And into that space, into the grief and the guilt and the particular vulnerability of a man who has just lost the domestic arrangement that gave his life its shape, Lumen Pierce arrives. Lumen is a survivor. The specifics of what she survived are graphic enough that the show handles them carefully. But the core of it is this: she was one of several women abused and violated by a group of men connected to a man named Jordan Chase, a self-help guru who organized the abuse as a kind of performance, a demonstration of the power he was selling to his followers. Lumen survived. Several women did not. And Lumen, having survived, does not want therapy or witness protection or the careful intervention of the legitimate justice system. She wants the men who did this to her to die. Dexter helps her. Now, the code's fifth pillar says work alone. We already spent a great deal of time with what happened the last time Dexter ignored that pillar in Season 3, with Miguel Prado and Ellen Wolf and the long and painful process of cleaning up what the exception created. You would think, given how recently and how badly that went, that the fifth pillar would be the most reinforced wall in Dexter's internal architecture going into Season 5. And yet, there is a difference, Dexter tells himself, between what happened with Miguel and what is happening with Lumen. Miguel was a man who wanted permission. Lumen is a woman who deserves justice that the system cannot deliver. Miguel was predatory in his interest in Dexter's secret. Lumen is a victim who has found an ally. The situations are not the same, and Dexter's reasoning for why they are different is not entirely wrong. But it misses the point of the fifth pillar. The fifth pillar does not distinguish between good reasons and bad reasons for involving another person. It does not say you cannot share the dark unless the other person has a good enough reason. It says you cannot share the dark. Period. Because the damage that comes from sharing is not a function of the other person's intentions. It is a function of the nature of what is being shared. Dexter does not just help Lumen hunt the men who hurt her, he teaches her. He stands beside her as she delivers kills. He lets her put her hands on the process. He becomes, for the second time in the show's run, a teacher of the dark passenger. He becomes Harry, passing something on that Harry specifically built not to be passed on. Now, I want to be careful here, because Season 5 handles this storyline with more emotional intelligence than a simple rule violation framing might suggest. The relationship between Dexter and Lumen is genuinely moving. It is one of the warmer and more human things in the entire series. Dexter, who has spent his entire adult life performing emotions for other people, genuinely feels something with Lumen. Not performed, not manufactured, something that arrives without being summoned, and the show earns that. But the code does not have a clause for something that arrives without being summoned. The code says the same thing it always says. And the specific thing worth noting about Lumen beyond the fifth pillar violation is this. Some of the men in Jordan Chase's group, when you apply the code's first rule rigorously and honestly, do not clearly meet the standard. They participated in horrific abuse. They are complicit in the deaths of multiple women. But the code's first rule says killers. It says people who have murdered and will murder again. For some members of the group, that standard, applied with the strictness Harry intended, is a gray area. Dexter does not stop to evaluate the gray. He moves forward because Lumen needs this and because he wants to give it to her. That is emotion steering the knife. Not rage this time, not fascination, as with Trinity, love, or something close enough to love that the distinction does not matter to the code. Harry's fourth pillar does not care whether the emotion driving the kill is ugly or beautiful. Emotion is emotion. And Dexter, in Season 5, is absolutely guided by feeling. Lumen eventually leaves, her darkness lifts after the last of the men is gone, and she discovers, as the show frames it, that she is not a person built to carry this permanently the way Dexter is. She goes, and Dexter is alone again with the code, which has been bent twice in this season and which stands up from it looking more bent than before. The fifth pillar has now been violated twice in consecutive seasons, against all precedent and all warning. The lesson of Miguel did not hold. It held for exactly one season, and then gave way to a grief that was powerful enough to find a new justification for the same mistake. Harry's voice in Dexter's head, which is always present in the earlier seasons, becomes quieter in Season 5. And a quieter Harry is never a good sign. Season 6 is the season of Dexter that most people remember as a step down in quality from what came before, and I think that assessment is largely fair. The big twist of the season, the reveal that Professor James Geller has been dead the entire time, and that Travis Marshall has been operating alone in a dissociative state, is a structural choice that the show commits to in ways that work dramatically, but that create some real problems when you examine them from the code's perspective. Here's the thing about the Geller situation. Dexter spends most of Season 6 investigating Professor Geller as the primary architect of a series of apocalyptic murders. He builds a case. He applies the code's verification process, or at least a version of it. He accumulates evidence. He moves toward a kill, and then the reveal arrives. Geller has been dead for a long time. Travis Marshall, Geller's former student, is suffering from a severe dissociative disorder and has been operating under the delusion that Geller is still present, still directing him, still the mastermind behind the murders. What the twist reveals, beneath the dramatic shock of it, is that Dexter's verification process failed. He was building a case against a corpse. He was applying the code's logic to someone who did not exist. And he came close, in the narrative leading up to the reveal, to acting on information that was completely incorrect. The code's verification requirement is not a formality. It is the weight-bearing pillar of the whole structure. It is the thing that separates what Dexter does from ordinary murder. The idea that he could spend an extended period targeting the wrong person, moving through the entire ritual of the code toward an execution that would have been wrong in every possible way, should be more disturbing than the show allows it to be. The code is only as good as the investigation supporting it, and the investigation in Season 6 is genuinely flawed. There is also the question of Travis Marshall himself. When Dexter eventually kills Travis in the Season 6 finale, he is killing a man who is genuinely clinically ill. Travis Marshall is not evil in the way that Arthur Mitchell was evil, or Brian Moser was evil. He is a profoundly disturbed person whose mental illness has been catastrophically exploited, first by his relationship with Geller and then by the disorder itself. Whether a man who cannot fully comprehend his own actions, who is living inside a delusion that the show presents as genuine and total, meets the code's standard of a killer who deserves what Dexter does to them, is a question that deserves more examination than Season 6 gives it. Dexter does not ask that question. He moves forward with the kill the way he always does, with the code's vocabulary intact and the code's interrogation absent. And that gap between the language of the code and the actual moral work the code is supposed to require is a sign of how the code has changed since the beginning of the show. In Season 1, Dexter was scrupulous about verification. He was careful. He was methodical in the deepest sense of that word. By Season 6, the code is being applied with more confidence and less rigor, more certainty and less interrogation. The code has become, in part, a habit, and habits are dangerous precisely because they replace thinking. Now let me talk about the kill in Season 6, that is, by the code's own logic, the most straightforwardly motivated code violation of the season. It is the one involving a man named Nick. Nick is a young man who shoots and kills Brother Sam. Brother Sam is a reformed killer who has found genuine faith and who has become, during Season 6, one of Dexter's most unexpected and authentic human connections. Brother Sam sees something in Dexter that is not the dark passenger. He sees the possibility of something else. And his presence in Dexter's life represents, briefly and beautifully, the kind of genuine human relationship that the code's loneliness has always prevented Dexter from having. When Nick shoots Brother Sam, Dexter tracks him down and kills him. And Nick, technically, qualifies under the code. He murdered someone. He is a killer. The victim selection is correct. If you apply the first rule mechanically, Nick fits. But the way Dexter kills Nick is not mechanical. It is personal. It is driven by grief, by the loss of Brother Sam, by the specific anger of a man who has lost something genuinely rare and good. Dexter kills Nick because he is furious and heartbroken, and the code is the vehicle he uses to do it. He backs into the code's first rule and uses it to authorize what is, in his internal experience, a revenge killing. Harry's fourth pillar is about exactly this. The pillar does not say you cannot kill someone who is also guilty. It says you cannot let emotion be the engine. Because the moment you let emotion be the engine, you lose the thing that makes the code different from what it is trying to oppose. You become the thing you are hunting. A person who kills because they feel like it. A person who happens to have a very sophisticated framework for convincing themselves that the feeling has been legitimized by the rules. Season 6 is not the worst season for the code in terms of outright violation. That comes later. But it is the season where the code's intellectual honesty starts to genuinely erode, where the verification process gets sloppy, where the emotional filtering gets porous, where the distance between what the code was designed to be and what it has become in practice starts to be visible to anyone paying attention. including, perhaps, to Dexter himself. Though he will not say it that way, he never quite says it that way. Season 7 of Dexter begins with the moment that the show had been building toward in different ways since the very first episode. Deborah Morgan, who has loved Dexter her entire life and who has spent years working alongside him without ever truly understanding what she was working alongside, follows him to a church where he has taken Travis Marshall. She watches Dexter kill Travis in the full ritual with the knife and the plastic wrap, and the deliberateness of someone who has done this many times. She watches her brother the way Dokes watched him from across the hall of Miami Metro, with the sudden and total understanding that the thing she was looking at was real and had always been real, and that she had simply not had the frame of reference to see it until now. The Season 7 premiere is called Are You? And the question it is asking is addressed to Dexter. Are you what Deborah now thinks you are? Are you what the code has always required you to be? Are you a man with a framework, or a man who has been using a framework to describe something that no longer matches the description? By the end of Season 7, those questions have their answer, and the answer is devastating. Let me start with Hannah McKay because Hannah is the most emotionally complex code violation in the show's run. She is a convicted killer who served time for the death of her abusive husband and who, after her release, continued to kill. She is a poisoner, which means her method is careful and quiet and enormously difficult to prove. She has killed multiple people. She will, in all likelihood, kill again. By every measure of the code's first rule, Hannah McKay belongs on Dexter's table. And Dexter knows this. He begins the investigation, he does the research, he works the verification process, he accumulates the evidence, he gets Hannah to his table in the full ritual. And then he does not kill her. He falls in love with her instead. This is not a subtle thing. It is not a delayed decision or a pause for further verification. Dexter looks at Hannah McKay and recognizes something that he has never recognized in another person who is not also a killer, and which he has only rarely recognized even then. She sees the dark passenger and is not afraid of it. She does not run from it or try to reform it or pretend it is not there. She absorbs it the way she absorbs everything, calmly and completely, and she offers in return the thing that the code's enforced loneliness has always denied Dexter, someone who knows him entirely. So he does not kill her. He turns her into the police instead. And this is the double violation that is worth examining carefully because it has two distinct layers. The first layer is straightforward. Dexter has a qualified target and chooses not to act on it because of his feelings. The fourth pillar again, emotion steering the knife. Or in this case, emotion staying the knife. Either way, the pillar fails. But the second layer is subtler and in some ways more interesting. Dexter's decision to turn Hannah over to the police is, by the code's founding logic, a contradiction. The code exists because the legitimate justice system is imperfect, because it lets people fall through the cracks, because the bureaucratic and legal mechanisms that society uses to address evil are sometimes simply not up to the task. That is the premise on which Harry built everything. That is why Dexter exists as a concept. And in Season 7, when Dexter finds a qualified target that he cannot bring himself to kill, his solution is to hand her to the system that the code was created to bypass. He uses the imperfect mechanism as a repository for someone who has beaten it before. Hannah does beat it again. She escapes custody. And Dexter helps her escape. He helps a person who qualifies for the code, who he already failed to kill once, evade the backup system he used when he failed the first time. He helps her disappear. And then he falls in love with her again. By the end of Season 7 and into Season 8, Hannah McKay is the person Dexter has chosen to build a life around, the person he is planning a future with. The code's first rule has been set aside for her so completely that it is not even being negotiated with anymore. It has simply been removed from the conversation about Hannah. The code applies to everyone except her, and the exception is love. Harry did not build an exception for love. Harry understood that love was exactly the kind of force that required the most vigilance, not the least. Harry would have seen what was happening with Hannah and recognized it immediately as the most dangerous thing in the room, because love that is built on shared darkness does not stay still. It grows and it spreads, and it demands things that the code absolutely cannot deliver. And Dexter, who spent 20 years honoring that understanding, walks away from it for Hannah McKay. Now let me talk about Isaac Serco, because Isaac is a different kind of code violation, quieter and more transactional, but worth examining because of what it says about the trajectory the code is on by Season 7. Isaac Serco is an enforcer for the Koshka Brotherhood, a Ukrainian organized crime organization. He has killed people. He continues to pose a threat. By the code's first rule, he qualifies. He is, in the technical language of the code, a candidate. Dexter knows this, and at some point during Season 7, Dexter and Isaac find themselves facing a shared threat from another faction of the Brotherhood, men who want both of them dead for different reasons, so they make a deal. Dexter agrees to help Isaac manage the threat. Isaac agrees to call off the Brotherhood's contract on Dexter, and for a portion of Season 7, these two men, one of whom the code identifies as a target, operate in something like cooperation. Dexter is not just failing to pursue a qualified target, he is actively assisting one. He is putting his skills and his access and his knowledge in service of keeping a man who belongs on his table alive and functioning. The code does not have a clause for mutually beneficial arrangements with murder suspects. It does not have a section on practical exceptions for self-preservation. The code says the targets are the targets. And Dexter's willingness to sideline that in Season 7, to treat the code's imperatives as negotiable when negotiating them serves his own interests, is one of the clearest signs that the code has become, by this point in the story, mostly a performance. He still uses the language, he still goes through the ritual, but the code is no longer governing his decisions. His decisions are governing the code, bending it to fit what he has already decided to do. And then we arrive at Maria Laguerta. Lieutenant Maria Laguerta is many things across the run of the original series. She is ambitious. She is occasionally ruthless in the way that ambitious people sometimes are. She has made choices, professionally and personally, that the show does not always frame sympathetically. She is a complicated character, as most of the characters on Dexter are. But Maria Laguerta is not a murderer. She has not killed anyone outside the bounds of her professional authority. She has not slipped through any crack in the justice system. She is not a person who poses a threat to future victims in the way the code's first rule is designed to address. She is a cop who has done her job with the tools available to her, and the tool she has been using in Season 7, the tool she has been applying with genuine skill and determination, is the investigation into the Bay Harbor butcher. And she is right, just as Dokes was right years before her. Laguerta has looked at the evidence from Dokes' death, from the Bay Harbor butcher case, from the blood slides and the forensic signature and the timeline, and she has assembled the correct conclusion. Dexter Morgan is the Bay Harbor butcher. She does not have irrefutable proof yet, but she is close. She is closer than anyone has been since Dokes. In the Season 7 finale, an episode called Surprise Motherfucker, Maria Laguerta is shot and killed by Deborah Morgan. I want to let that sit for a moment before we go on, because I think it deserves to sit. James Dokes was an innocent man who died because of Dexter's inaction. Lila killed him, and Dexter allowed the conditions for that killing to exist. There was a degree of removal there, a degree of deniability, which Dexter would tell you matters and Harry's code would tell you very firmly does not. But there was removal. With Maria Laguerta, the situation is different from Dokes in a way that is somehow even harder to look at. Dexter has Laguerta tranquilized and is staging the scene to make it appear she and a drug lord named Estrada killed each other. He's about to complete it when Deborah arrives. Laguerta wakes up and turns to Deborah. She pleads with her, tells her this is not who she is, that she is a cop, a good person, not like him. She tells Deborah to put Dexter down, and Deborah, standing in that room with everything she knows about her brother and everything she loves about him, and everything she has already given up for him, makes a choice that will define the rest of her life. She shoots Laguerta. Not Dexter, Laguerta. He looks at her, and he applies the code's vocabulary to a situation where the code's vocabulary does not fit. And he finds a way to describe what has just happened as necessary, as self-preservation, as the protection of his family, of Deborah, of the life he has built. He uses the language of the code to authorize a killing that the code cannot authorize. Because the code's second rule, which says never kill the innocent, applies to Maria Laguerta more clearly than it has applied to anyone in the entire series. She is innocent, she is a cop doing her job, she is right about what she suspects, and she dies for it. This is the moment that the Code of Harry truly ends, not as an idea, not as a word that Dexter continues to use, but as a functioning moral framework. From the night of the Season 7 finale forward, the Code is a story Dexter tells about himself. It is not a constraint he lives inside. It cannot be after Lagerta. A constraint that has a working exception for the murder of an innocent police officer who is correctly investigating you is not a constraint at all. It is decoration. Harry Morgan built the Code to prevent exactly this. Not metaphorically, literally this. The specific scenario in which Dexter's need for self-preservation becomes the reason an innocent person dies. Harry understood somewhere in the design of the rules that this was the failure mode. That a man like Dexter would eventually find himself in a position where the Code's second rule and the Code's third rule were pointing in opposite directions, where protecting an innocent and protecting the secret were mutually exclusive, and that in that moment the man would have to choose between his rules and himself. Harry tried to build rules strong enough to govern that choice. He did not succeed. The man he loved chose himself, and Maria Lagerta is buried with that choice. Deborah, who was present at the kill, who pulled the trigger herself in a moment of terrible confusion and love for her brother, will carry it differently. She will carry it the way innocent people carry things they were not built to carry, which is to say badly and at enormous cost. But that is a different story, and Season 8 is where it plays out. For now, I want to sit with Season 7 for one more moment and acknowledge what the show does with this conclusion. Because the Season 7 finale is not triumphant. It is not cathartic in the way that crime dramas sometimes make moral compromise feel cathartic. The final image of it is Dexter and Deborah standing over Lagerta's body, and the feeling in the room is not relief. It is something much colder and much heavier than relief. It is the feeling of a line crossed so far that the crossing cannot be undone. The Code is dead. Something continues, but the Code is dead. Season 8 of Dexter is a complicated season to love, and I say that as someone who has watched it in full more than once. It has moments that are genuinely good. It has a performance from Michael C. Hall that remains extraordinary even when the material around it is uneven. It has a late season stretch where the emotional stakes feel real and immediate, in a way that the middle of the season struggles to achieve. And it has a finale, Remember the Monsters, that is remembered almost universally as a disappointment, with an IMDb rating that sits somewhere between 4.6 and 4.9, which is the lowest rating of any episode in the entire original series run. But for our purposes tonight, Season 8 is interesting not primarily because of its quality or its reception. It is interesting because of what it tells us about the trajectory of the Code after the Lagerta killing. Because if Season 7 is the season where the Code dies, Season 8 is the season where the body is cleaned up and the surface is made presentable. And Dexter tries, one more time, to describe himself as a man with a moral framework. The central relationship of Season 8 is between Dexter and Dr. Evelyn Vogel, a neuropsychiatrist specializing in psychopaths who is introduced as the woman who helped Harry Morgan design the Code in the first place. Vogel was Harry's advisor, his collaborator, the person who looked at young Dexter and told Harry that what he was seeing was real, and that a structured framework was the most responsible response to it. She is, in a sense, the architect's architect. The Code came from Harry, but Harry came to Vogel first. Vogel's a fascinating character for exactly this reason. She does not treat the Code the way Harry treats it in the flashbacks, with the particular gravity of a parent trying to protect a child. She treats it more clinically, more analytically, which makes her a useful lens for the show to use to examine the Code at this late stage, when it has been bent and broken and patched over so many times that the original architecture is barely visible. What Vogel sees when she looks at Dexter in Season 8 is someone who has been using the Code as scaffolding for a while now, not living inside it, using it. And she seems, in the particular way of someone who built the thing and understands its limitations, to accept that, to treat it as an expected outcome, which is its own kind of indictment. The Code's antagonist in Season 8 is a killer known as the Brain Surgeon, who is eventually revealed to be Oliver Saxon, a man with a history of violence and a deeply personal connection to Vogel. Saxon is genuinely dangerous. He is a killer. He qualifies under the Code by any honest application of its first rule. And Dexter's investigation of Saxon follows the Code's process more carefully than anything Dexter has done in several seasons, which is worth noting. He is more deliberate in Season 8 than he was in the later years of Seasons 6 and 7. Whether this is because Vogel's presence has reinvigorated something or simply because the show is trying to remind the audience of who Dexter was before the Lagerta killing, it is there. And then Saxon kills Vogel. He kills her in her own home in a way designed to be witnessed. And Dexter, who has just lost the woman who helped build the framework that is supposed to govern his every kill, goes after Saxon with something that is very far from the methodical deliberateness that the code requires. He finds Saxon in the interrogation room at Miami Metro Jail. Batista and Quinn have just finished questioning him and stepped out. Saxon is alone, unarmed, sitting across a table from nobody but Dexter. He is being held by the legitimate justice system that the code has always treated as insufficient and inadequate, but which is, in this moment, functioning. Saxon is caught. He is in custody. He's going to face consequences. Dexter picks up a pen. He plunges it into Saxon's throat. There is no table, no plastic wrap, no blood slide, no verification because Saxon is already verified. No ritual because the ritual has not felt necessary. Just a pen and a choice made in about 3 seconds by a man who is not honoring the code, who is not doing what Harry taught him, who is killing because he is grief-stricken and enraged, and because Saxon is there and the opportunity is there, and because the code at this point in the story is a habit that Dexter reaches for when it is convenient and sets aside when it is not. This is not the code of Harry. This is revenge. Clean and simple and completely devoid of the moral architecture that was supposed to separate what Dexter does from what he is trying to oppose. When Dexter kills Oliver Saxon in that interview room, he is not a man with a framework. He is a man acting on feeling, which is the thing Harry built the code to prevent, which is, in the most fundamental sense, the opposite of everything the code was ever supposed to be. And then there is the finale. Dexter's last act in the original series, he drives his boat into a hurricane, he apparently dies. The final scene of the original series shows him alive, working as a lumberjack in Oregon, bearded and alone in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, the slice of life replaced by a logging truck and a rundown rental house. He has left Harrison, his infant son, with Hannah McKay. He has abandoned the only other person in his life who shares his blood, his child, the last connection to Rita, because he has concluded that the people who get close to him die. 10 years pass. When we find him again, in new blood, he has moved on from Oregon, now living under the name Jim Lindsay in the small fictional town of Iron Lake in upstate New York, alone with his woodpile and his goats, and a calendar on the wall that he marks off day by day, counting the time since his last kill. It is not a code violation in the formal sense. The code never addressed what to do with your children, but it is the logical endpoint of a journey that the code was always moving toward. Dexter, who was shaped by abandonment, by a trauma that begins in a shipping container with his mother's blood, ultimately abandons his son in the same way. Not in a shipping container, but with the same essential choice, the same conclusion that safety requires distance. The finale of Season 8 was badly received for many reasons, most of which have been discussed extensively. But from where we are sitting tonight, having followed the code's trajectory from the beginning, the finale's failure makes a kind of sense. Not narrative sense, not in the way the show framed it, but moral sense. A man who has spent 8 seasons dismantling the framework that was supposed to give his life meaning, rule by rule and violation by violation, does not get a satisfying ending. Not because the show is punishing him, because satisfying endings are for people who resolve something. Dexter in the Season 8 finale has not resolved anything. He has retreated from it. He has put his boat into a storm and let the storm make the decision for him. That is not the code. Harry built the code so that Dexter would never have to let storms make decisions, so that every choice would be deliberate and considered and governed by something larger than the moment. The man standing on the dock in the Season 8 finale, looking out at the ocean, is a man from whom the code has departed so completely that what remains is just the storm. 10 years pass. That is the gap between the Season 8 finale of the original series and the events of Dexter, New Blood, the 10-episode limited series that premiered in November of 2021 and concluded in January of 2022. 10 years of marked-off calendars in a small cabin in upstate New York. 10 years of a white deer in the snow. 10 years of a man named Jim Lindsay, who is, in every way that matters, Dexter Morgan pretending to be someone he is not, and doing it more convincingly than Dexter Morgan has ever pretended to be anything. Because this time the pretense is not the mask over the dark passenger. This time the pretense is the absence of the dark passenger itself. He has not killed in 10 years. That is established clearly in the first episode of New Blood. He has constructed a life in Iron Lake, New York, that has all the outward markers of normalcy, a girlfriend, a job, a community, relationships that feel genuine even when the man at the center of them is not quite who he appears to be. He has been marking off days the way prisoners mark off days. He is counting towards something, he just does not know what. And then Matt Caldwell comes into his life. Matt is arrogant and wealthy and careless in the way that people are careless when they have always been protected from the consequences of their carelessness. He killed 5 people in a boating accident deliberately and was acquitted through the combination of his father's money and his friend's testimony. He is, by the code's first rule, a qualified target. He is a killer who has escaped justice. The first rule is satisfied. Dexter kills Matt in the second episode of New Blood, out in the winter woods, during a confrontation that he does not fully plan. 10 years of control snap in a moment, not because the code has been carefully applied, but because something in Dexter breaks through the surface, and Matt Caldwell is there when it does. And this is worth examining carefully, because the code's verification process, applied at its best, is a deliberate and cumulative thing. It involves research and confirmation, and the careful accumulation of evidence before the kill is authorized. Dexter knows that Matt killed 5 people from a single source, a private conversation at a party. He has not built a case the way he built cases in Season 1. He has not cross-referenced, he has not gone through the steps, he has responded to a trigger. To be fair, Matt Caldwell is genuinely guilty. The information is accurate. He did kill those 5 people. In the final accounting, the first rule is satisfied by fact even if it was not satisfied by process. The outcome is correct, but the process is rushed. After 10 years of dormancy, the code comes back not as a framework Dexter applies thoughtfully, but as something closer to instinct. And instinct is not the code. Instinct is the dark passenger. Harry built the code precisely to put something between the dark passenger and the action it demands. That buffer in New Blood's early episodes is thinner than it has ever been. Dexter disposes of Matt's body, reestablishes himself in Iron Lake, and the season moves forward. Kurt Caldwell, Matt's father, turns out to be a serial killer himself, a man who has been murdering young women and draining their blood and displaying them in his underground bunker for decades. By the time Dexter establishes this, the code's verification process has had time to do its work. Kurt qualifies clearly. His killing is confirmed. His future threat is not in question. Dexter kills Kurt, and the code in that specific kill is genuinely honored. But New Blood is not ultimately a story about whether Dexter can reapply the code correctly after 10 years. It is a story about something else entirely. It is a story about Harrison. Harrison Morgan finds his father in Iron Lake. He is a teenager by this point, a young man shaped by a childhood of loss and instability and the particular trauma of being Dexter Morgan's son. He has been through foster care, he has developed his own relationship with violence, and he has, over the course of the season, begun to see what his father is. Not all at once, not in a single confrontation. Gradually, the way truth usually arrives when you are living alongside it. Harrison watches his father. He watches how Dexter moves through the world. He watches the quality of his stillness and the shape of the things he will not say. And he recognizes, as Dokes recognized 20 years before him, something true. In the New Blood finale, Harrison holds a gun to his father's head. And here's the thing about that moment, the thing that makes it different from every other moment we have discussed tonight. Dexter talks Harrison through it. He does not run. He does not fight. He does not produce a reason why the code argues for his continued existence. He tells Harrison who he is. He tells Harrison what he has done. He acknowledges the accounting with more honesty than he has applied to his own life in perhaps the entire run of the series. And he allows Harrison to make the decision. Harrison shoots his father. Dexter Morgan, the man the code was built to govern, dies at his son's hands in the snow of Iron Lake, New York. And the question I want to sit with for a moment before we move into the closing section of tonight's video is this. Is that a code violation? In the formal sense, no. Dexter does not kill anyone he should not kill in the New Blood finale. He does not break a rule. He walks toward a bullet and lets it find him. But in the deeper sense, in the sense that the code was always about more than victim selection and ritual and the careful mechanics of a kill, the New Blood finale is the code's last act. Dexter engineers his own execution. He uses his relationship with his son as the instrument of an ending he cannot bring himself to simply choose. He puts the weight of his death on Harrison's shoulders the way Harry once put the weight of the code on Dexter's shoulders. He passes the darkness on. Harry built the code so that Dexter would live with it, not die because of it. Harry's framework was designed for a lifetime of managed darkness. Not this, not a father who ends up in his son's sights and stays there. Harry would not have recognized what happened in Iron Lake as the code. He would not have recognized it as the outcome he was working toward. But it is the only outcome the code's violations were ever going to produce. Every crack in Season 1, every fractured pillar in Seasons 2 and 3 and 4, every Lagerda and every Dokes and every Hannah McKay, all of it was moving in one direction, toward a reckoning, toward someone who had been watching getting close enough to act. The only difference is that the person watching at the end was not a cop or an investigator or a survivor with a gun. It was his son. It was blood. And blood, which is where the code always began, is where it ends. There's a character in Dexter who never breaks the code because the code was never hers to break. She did not know it existed. She was not asked to follow it. And yet she is, across the entire run of the series and into New Blood, the person who pays the highest price for it. Higher than Dokes, who was right and died for it. Higher than Rita, who was innocent and died for it. Higher even than Lagerta, who was closer to the truth than anyone should have been allowed to get. Deborah Morgan is the code's most complete casualty because she is the one who survives it. Surviving costs more than dying sometimes, and Deborah Morgan pays that cost in full. Deborah is Dexter's adoptive sister. She is Harry Morgan's biological daughter. She has lived her entire life in the overlapping shadows of those two facts, shaped by a father who was always keeping something from her, and a brother who loved her in the only way he could, which was through a mask she did not know was a mask. She becomes a police officer, like Harry. She becomes a detective, a genuinely good one, sharp and instinctive, and occasionally brilliant, in the way that people who trust their gut rather than the manual sometimes are. She is, from every external vantage point, exactly the person Harry raised. And Harry raised her to be useful, not instrumentally, not in the calculated way of someone using a person as a tool. But Harry, who knew what Dexter was, and spent so much of his energy building the code around that knowledge, also understood that Deborah needed to be close to Dexter. Not because Dexter needed a guardian, not exactly, but because Dexter needed an anchor, a tether to the world that felt real. Someone whose presence made the performance sustainable. Deborah, without knowing it, was built into the architecture of the code from the beginning. She was the human element that kept the machine running. She never knew any of this. And I want you to sit with that for a moment because I think it deserves more examination than it usually gets. Deborah Morgan spends the first 6.5 seasons of Dexter loving a brother who is protecting her from a truth that would have destroyed her. She is not protected out of cruelty. She is protected out of love or something that functions like it. But she is also denied, without her knowledge or consent, the right to know what she is embedded in. Every relationship she has with Dexter, every late-night conversation, every shared meal, every moment of genuine connection, every time she goes to him with something real and he receives it with the warmth of his manufactured persona, all of it is happening against a backdrop she cannot see. And that background, the dark passenger and the kills and the code and the blood slides and everything else, is the most important fact about the person she loves most. This is not something the code addresses. Harry's rules were built to manage the dark passenger, not to account for the full cost of secrecy on the people the secret is kept from. Harry protected Deborah from Dexter's truth because he thought it was the right thing to do. But he did not fully reckon with what that protection cost her over time. The dissonance of loving someone you do not fully know. The accumulated weight of being close to a person whose life you only understand partially. And Deborah, who was brought to the kill room by coincidence and then stayed because Dexter needed her, who has spent the entire season trying to find a way to save her brother from himself, makes the worst choice she will ever make. She pulls the trigger. She kills Maria Laguerta herself in the moment of confusion and love and desperation that the show constructs around the decision. Laguerta does not die because Dexter pulled the trigger that time. Laguerta dies because Deborah, who was never supposed to be anywhere near any of this, who was always supposed to be protected from all of it by the code and by Harry and by Dexter's own careful performance, ends up in the room. And once she is in the room, once she is holding a gun and Laguerta is alive and Dexter's secret is about to end, the decision falls to Deborah. The code, which was supposed to keep this away from her, delivers it directly into her hands. That is the code's most complete failure. Not the Laguerta killing itself, not the outcome, but the path it traveled to reach Deborah Morgan, a woman who should never have been there, who should have been protected, who Harry and Dexter and all the rules they built together should have kept completely outside the radius of anything like this. The code failed to keep its secret, and Deborah, who was the code's human anchor, its emotional grounding wire, becomes instead its most damaged survivor. Season 8 charts Deborah's deterioration. She drinks. She makes bad choices. She pushes the people who care about her away with both hands. She is processing something that the human psychology of a woman raised to believe in justice cannot process without cost. She carries the Laguerta, killing the way some people carry things that weigh more than their frame can handle, which is to say poorly and visibly and at enormous expense to everything else in her life. And then, in the Season 8 finale, she is shot. She survives the shooting, but suffers a stroke from the complications. And Dexter, who has made the arrangements that will allow him to disappear into the storm, sits with her while she goes. He takes her off life support. He carries her body to his boat. He takes her out to sea. It is the most human thing Dexter does in the entire series. Not the code, not the ritual, not the careful mechanics of any kill. Carrying his sister's body to the place where all the others rest. And it is devastating in a way that does not fully register in the moment, but that accumulates afterward when you think about what it means. Deborah Morgan, who was never supposed to be anywhere near the code, is buried by it in the end. Not as a target, as a loved one, as the person who was closest to the center of all of this and who paid the highest price for a proximity she never chose. The code was built in part to protect people like Deborah. Harry understood that Dexter's secret was dangerous to the people around him. He built the code to minimize that danger. He built it to keep the dark passenger pointed away from the innocent. And in Deborah's case, across the full arc of the series, the code failed more completely than it failed anywhere else. Because the protection it was supposed to provide, the distance and the secrecy and the careful management of information, did not save her. It preserved her right up until the moment it needed her, and then it used her up. That is the code's true final accounting. Not the list of violations. The people. Dokes, who was right and died, caged in the Everglades. Rita, who was innocent and died in a bathtub while Dexter was being curious about the man who killed her. Laguerta, who was right and died in the moment she was closest to the truth. And Deborah, who loved Dexter her entire life and carried the weight of his truth for 2 seasons and was buried at sea. The code was supposed to prevent all of them. It did not prevent any of them. And the question of why it did not, the real answer to that question is not that the rules were wrong. The rules were actually quite good. The answer is that the rules were applied by a human being who loved people, who could not hold the framework steady when love was pulling in another direction, who broke the code every single time, not out of carelessness or malice, but out of the thing that the code was never designed to govern. Harry built a framework for a son he believed could not fully love. He built it without accounting for the possibility that he was wrong about that. And being wrong about that, over 20-something years and 8 seasons of television and 10 episodes of New Blood, cost everyone around Dexter Morgan more than any of them deserved to pay. Before we arrive at the closing thoughts for tonight, I want to spend some time with something that does not get examined as often as the code's rules, but that is, in its own way, just as revealing. Not the rules themselves, but the ritual that grew up around them. The way Dexter kills. The ceremony of it. What that ceremony means and what it tells us when it starts to change. The kill in Dexter's practice has a shape. It has always had a shape. The research comes first, the accumulation of evidence, the careful building of a case that can survive the scrutiny of the code's verification requirement. Then the acquisition, the careful engineering of a situation in which the target is isolated and controlled. Then the kill room, the plastic-wrapped table, the particular combination of the needle and the restraints, and the face-to-face confrontation that precedes the knife. Then the blood slide, the small and intimate trophy, the sliver of the kill kept in the box behind the air conditioning unit. Then the disposal, the careful dismemberment, and the ocean, the evidence scattered wide enough that it cannot be reassembled. Each of these steps is part of a ceremony, not in the theatrical sense, not in the sense of performance for its own sake, but in the deeper sense of a ritual that has meaning because it has been honored consistently. The ceremony is the code made physical. It is the abstract rules translated into specific actions. You could read the code as a document and understand it intellectually, but watching Dexter move through the kill ritual is understanding it in the body, in the way that the shape of a ceremony communicates something that plain language cannot. And the ceremony matters because it is the ceremony, more than the rules themselves, that creates the distance between what Dexter does and what the code is designed to prevent. The ceremony forces deliberateness, it forces time, it requires a sequence that cannot be rushed without losing something essential. A kill without the ceremony is not a code kill. A kill without the table and the plastic and the confrontation and the blood slide is just a murder. And Harry, who understood Dexter better than almost anyone, built the ceremony alongside the rules, precisely because the ceremony does the emotional work that the rules alone cannot do. It slows everything down. It makes Dexter look at what he is doing. It demands a face. The confrontation before the kill, the moment where Dexter shows the target the evidence of their crimes and watches them understand what is happening, that is not theatrical. It is not about enjoyment. It is about accountability. The code requires that the target know why. It requires that the justice being delivered be, in some sense, legible, explained, not hidden in the dark. The ceremony is the code's way of insisting that what is happening is not random, that it has reason, that reason matters. Watch the early seasons and notice how complete the ceremony is. In Season 1, the ritual is meticulous, every step in order, every element in place. The ceremony is intact because the code is intact, because the belief in the code is intact. Dexter in Season 1 is a man who genuinely honors the shape of what Harry gave him. Now watch the ceremony across the seasons. Notice what falls away. The research gets shorter in the middle seasons, the verification steps get compressed. In Season 4, with Trinity, the research is thorough, but the timing is wrong, the ceremony delayed by curiosity until the delay becomes fatal. In Season 5, with some of Lumen's targets, the ceremony is shared, divided between two people in a way that changes its meaning, because the ceremony was designed for one. In Season 6, with Travis Marshall, there is something abbreviated about the final confrontation, something that feels more like conclusion than interrogation. By Season 7, with LaGuerta, there is no ceremony at all. There is just a moment, a gun, a decision made in seconds. And in Season 8, in the interview room with Oliver Saxon, there is a pen. That is all that remains of the ceremony by the end of the original series run. Not the table, or the plastic, or the confrontation, or the blood slide, or the careful ocean disposal. A pen used in a moment of grief and rage, in a room where the legitimate justice system is already doing its work. The ceremony has been reduced to its most primitive element, which is the impulse itself, unmediated, unritualized, pure dark passenger with no code between it and the action. That erosion is not accidental. It tracks exactly with the erosion of the code's pillars across the seasons. The ceremony and the rules are not separate things. They are expressions of the same intention. And as the intention weakens, as the code becomes more performance than practice, the ceremony that embodied it becomes thinner and eventually disappears. By the time Dexter kills Saxon with a pen, the ceremony is gone because there is nothing left to embody. The code exists in name only. The ritual that made it physical has been reduced to reflex. New Blood is interesting in this context because it represents a kind of attempted restoration. After 10 years, Dexter tries to kill Matt Caldwell with a version of the old ceremony. It is hasty and imperfect, driven more by instinct than by the methodical deliberateness that Harry built into the ritual. But it is recognizable. The attempt is there. He's trying to come back to the shape of it. And by the time he kills Kurt Caldwell, later in New Blood, the ceremony is more intact, more considered, closer to what it was in the beginning. But the restoration comes too late, and the final act of New Blood, Dexter's death, requires no ceremony at all. No table, no plastic, no blood slide. Just snow and a sun and a gun, and the only accounting that 20 years of violated code had been moving toward. The ceremony began as a form of discipline. It ended as a memory. And the space between those two things is the whole story of how a man who had rules became a man who had reasons. There is something I find genuinely moving about the blood slides when I think about them in this context. They are the one element of the ceremony that is entirely private. The kill room is practical, the disposal is necessary, the confrontation is the code's version of justice made visible. But the blood slides serve no practical purpose. They are not evidence, not trophies in the conventional sense, not warnings. They are kept in a small box, hidden, never shown to anyone. They are the only part of the ritual that is purely personal. Harry did not design the blood slides. The blood slides are Dexter's own addition to the ceremony. They are the thing he added when the code became his own, the sign that he had internalized the framework fully enough to make it personal. Each slide is a record, a mark on the wall, a way of keeping the kills present, of maintaining the connection to what the code required of him across years of doing it. They are, in a strange and quiet way, the most human element of the entire ritual, the most personal, the most his. When the blood slides are discovered in Season 2 and the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation begins, it is that discovery of all the forensic evidence Dexter has left behind that comes closest to exposing him. Not the bodies, not the dismemberment, not the disposal pattern. The slides, the small private thing, the personal record, the element of the ceremony that had nothing to do with practical necessity and everything to do with meaning. It is always the human element that costs the most. It is always the thing that was added for feeling rather than for function that turns out to be the most dangerous. Harry understood that. He would have told Dexter not to keep the slides. He would have seen the risk. But Dexter needed them in a way that the code could not explain, and that Harry's practical framework could not account for. He needed them because they were proof that what he was doing mattered, that it was not just compulsion dressed in moral language. The slides were the ceremony's way of insisting, privately and completely, that the code was real, that the kills meant something, that there was a difference between what Dexter did and what the people on his table had done. Whether that difference was ever as large as the slide suggested is the question that the series, in its best moments, is always asking. And it never quite answers it, not fully, not in a way that resolves. The slides sit in the air conditioning unit, and Dexter goes out to his boat, and the ocean is very large, and the code is what it is, which is a human attempt to give something inhuman a shape it can live with. That, more than anything else we have talked about tonight, is the code's enduring power as a storytelling device. Not the violations, not the deaths, the attempt. The fact that Harry Morgan, a father who loved his son, sat down with a woman named Evelyn Vogel and tried to build a conscience for a child who might not have been able to grow one on his own. The attempt to turn darkness into something with rules, something with shape, something that could look itself in the face and say, I know what I am, and I choose to be something more than the worst of it. The code failed. It always failed. But the attempt was extraordinary, and extraordinary attempts at impossible things are not nothing. They are sometimes the most important thing. There is a version of tonight's video that ends with the violation list. That counts them up, tallies the broken pillars, delivers a verdict on Dexter Morgan, and the code he was supposed to live by and did not. But I do not think that version is the honest one. I think the honest version has to go a step further than the accounting. It has to ask what all of it was for, not what the code was supposed to do, which we have covered at length, but what the whole arc of breaking it and living with breaking it and watching the people around Dexter pay for it, what all of that was actually trying to say. Because Dexter is a show that spent 8 seasons and a limited series and is now spending more time still inside the same essential question. Not whether Dexter is good or evil, That question was answered before the first episode ended. But whether a person who is built the way Dexter is built can change, whether the code or some version of it, or the love that the code was trying to accommodate, can produce something in a person that was not there before. Whether 20 years of trying to live inside a moral framework, even imperfectly, even while violating it in every direction, leaves a mark. Whether the attempt matters, I think it does. I think the show thinks it does. And I think Harry, who built the whole thing out of love for a child he was not going to stop being afraid for, knew it too. I want to slow down now. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, from the first quiet crack in Season 1 to the snow in Iron Lake, and I think we have earned a moment to step back from the specific violations and look at the larger shape of what we have been tracing. Because I do not think the code violations are the story. I think they are windows into the story. And what is visible through those windows, when you look carefully, is something more interesting and more complicated than a list of rules that got broken. Let me ask a question that sounds simple, but is not. What was the code of Harry actually for? The answer that the show offers in its first season, and the answer that Dexter himself accepts for a long time, is that the code is for control. It is a framework designed to aim the dark passenger at targets that deserve what the dark passenger does to them, rather than at random victims or at innocents. It is a harm reduction strategy built by a father for a son who is going to cause harm regardless. The code is for control. But I think Harry understood something that the code itself does not quite say out loud. I think Harry built the code not just to contain Dexter's violence, but to make Dexter a person, to give him a structure around which something resembling a moral identity could form, to build alongside all the practical rules about victim selection and evidence and working alone, a thing that functions in Dexter the way conscience functions in other people. Not feeling exactly, because Harry was realistic about what Dexter could and could not feel, but something that acts in the place of feeling, something that says no when the dark passenger says yes. The code was a substitute conscience, and a substitute conscience is not the same as a real one, but it is something. It is better than nothing. It is the difference between a man who operates inside a moral framework, however imperfect and however instrumentalized that framework becomes over time, and a man who operates without any framework at all. Harry chose the framework because the alternative was unthinkable. What the series traces across all those years and all those violations is what happens when a substitute conscience encounters the things that real consciences have to navigate: love, grief, loneliness, betrayal. The specific weight of having someone see you clearly for the first time. The unbearable cost of being right about something. None of these things were factored into Harry's framework, because Harry built the code from what he knew, which was his son's violence, and not from what he could not anticipate, which was his son's humanity. That is the deep irony of the code. It was built to govern a man who Harry in part believed did not fully feel things the way other people do. The code's fourth pillar, the one about emotion, exists because Harry believed that Dexter's relationship to emotion was different enough from the norm that it could be managed with explicit rules. Keep emotion out of the kill. Keep the feeling separate from the action. Do not let what you want or what you feel drive what you do. But Dexter is not the man Harry believed he was. Or he is, but he is also more than that. He's a man who falls in love, genuinely and badly. A man who grieves, a man who forms attachments that cost him more than he expected, whose loss lands harder than the code designed for. And every single violation we talked about tonight, without exception, traces back to one of those attachments. To Brian because Brian was blood, to Dokes because Dexter could not face the consequence, to Miguel because Dexter was lonely, to Trinity because Dexter was curious and afraid in equal measure, to Lumen because Dexter was grieving and guilty, to Hannah because Dexter recognized something in her that he had never recognized anywhere else, to LaGuerta because Dexter drew his sister into the room and Deborah in that room made the choice that destroyed her. None of those are code violations in the way a rule violation in a game is a rule violation. They are not lapses of technical compliance. They are the places where the human being inside the code pushed against the walls Harry built, and the walls bent. They are the evidence that Harry was trying to govern something with rules that rules are not designed to govern. He was trying to use a framework to substitute for the kind of moral development that only comes from living inside real relationships and real consequences and real love. You cannot build a conscience with rules. You can build a framework. You can build a process. You can build a very sophisticated system that produces many of the same outcomes that a conscience produces, but you cannot build the thing itself. The thing itself has to grow. And the way it grows is through exactly the kinds of entanglements that the code was designed to prevent. Through Deborah and Rita and Miguel and Lumen and Harrison and all the rest of them. Through the violations, and so, in a strange way, I think the code violations are the most human thing about Dexter Morgan. Not the kills, not the ritual or the blood slides or the careful forensic management of his secret. The violations, the moments where the dark passenger was overruled not by the code, but by something warmer and messier and more difficult than the code. The moments where Dexter Morgan chose love over the framework Harry built to protect him from it. That does not make the outcomes okay. James Dokes is still dead. Rita Bennett is still dead. Maria Laguerta is still dead. Ellen Wolf is still dead. The people who died because of code violations did not die for a beautiful reason. They died because moral frameworks are imperfect, and human beings are more complicated than the frameworks designed to manage them. That is not a redemption, it is just a truth. But it is worth saying, on a night like this one, in the particular quiet that comes after spending a long evening inside the world of this show, that Dexter Morgan is not simply a monster who occasionally broke his rules. He is a man who was handed a substitute conscience at a young age and spent his entire adult life trying to live inside it and failing in all the ways that matter, and occasionally succeeding in ways that surprised him and losing people he loved along the way, and arriving finally in a small town in the snow where his son was waiting for him with the only question that the code had never answered. What does a man do when he has run out of rules to break? Harrison answered that question for him. Harrison, who carries his father's blood and his mother's absence and a decade of instability and the particular weight of being the son of Dexter Morgan, held a gun and saw his father clearly and made a choice that the code would never have authorized and that Harry could not have predicted, and that might, in some oblique and uncomfortable way, have been the most honest thing anyone who loved Dexter Morgan ever did for him. The code of Harry ended in the snow, not because Harrison pulled a trigger, but because everything the code was avoiding for 20-something years finally caught up with the man it was built to protect. And what caught up with him was not the law, not forensic evidence, not the legitimate justice system finally working as intended. What caught up with him was his son. The code was built by a father. It was undone by a father, or by the consequences of being one. I think Harry, if he had been there in that moment, if his ghost had been present in Iron Lake the way it was present in Dexter's mind for so many years, would have understood that. He would not have approved, but he would have understood. He would have understood that the rules were never going to be enough, that the substitute conscience he built was always going to crack against the real thing eventually, that you cannot teach a person to manage their darkness with rules and then expect the rules to hold when love arrives. Love does not negotiate with rules. Love was never going to negotiate with the code. And maybe that is the final thing worth saying about all of this. The Code of Harry is one of the most compelling moral frameworks in the history of television storytelling, precisely because it is so clearly insufficient for the thing it is trying to accomplish. It is brilliant and careful and full of real insight about how to contain something dangerous. And it fails. It fails consistently, across every season, in every direction, because it was built for a man who did not feel things the way other people do, and that man turned out to feel things exactly the way other people do, just more quietly and at greater cost. You do not spend this many evenings inside a show you do not love. You do not catalog the violations of a code that does not matter to you. The fact that we have spent this time with all of this, that we find these fractures worth examining and turning over and sitting with, is the proof of how much the story did right. The code fails, and the story that failure tells is one of the most human things the show ever managed to produce. Wherever you are tonight, I hope this has been a comfortable place to spend the evening. Whether you have been listening since the beginning or you have drifted in and out, whether you are still with me or already somewhere quieter, I hope the company was good. There is something about this show, about the particular combination of darkness and warmth and genuine human complication that it manages at its best, that makes it feel like exactly the right thing to spend a quiet evening inside. In a future video, I would love to spend some time with Harry Morgan himself. not just as the ghost in Dexter's head, but as the man he actually was. The cop who made an extraordinary and imperfect choice for an extraordinary and imperfect son. There is a whole video in Harry's story alone. I would also love, at some point, to spend a night inside New Blood from beginning to end. It deserves more time than we were able to give it tonight. Harrison Morgan is a character who rewards careful attention. But for now, the dark passenger is quiet, the code is at rest, and wherever you are, I hope you sleep well. Good night.